The man who created England was never meant to be king. Before this island had a flag or a name, a forgotten prince, exiled at 15 and nearly erased by rivals, would rise from obscurity to forge a nation from chaos. His name was Æthelstan, the most important ruler you've never heard of. This is how a lost boy became the architect of England. Æthelstan didn't just triumph, he nearly lost everything. At Brunanburh, he stood against the largest invasion force Britain had ever seen. Viking kings, Scottish warlords, and the armies of Strathclyde, all united to erase him. One defeat would have shattered his kingdom and ended the idea of England before it ever began. But victory came at a price. He buried brothers. He lost trusted allies. He spent years fighting rebellions that could have killed him before battle ever did. His triumphs were carved from exhaustion, betrayal, and the constant threat of annihilation. Yet somehow, the man who built the first true centralized English state, the king whose influence reached from Ireland to the Alps, whose law codes outshone every ruler of his age, vanished from national memory, overshadowed by Alfred, buried by successors who hated his power, and nearly erased by chroniclers with reasons to forget him. Why was England's true architect allowed to disappear? Today, we uncover the story they tried to hide, minute by minute, across fractured kingdoms, bloody frontiers, and the perilous courts of early medieval Britain. Britain in the late 9th century, the world Æthelstan was born into, was not a country. It was a battlefield stitched together with fragile truces. Wessex and Mercia were the last defenses against collapse, fighting Viking armies that had already erased entire kingdoms. To the east, the Danelaw wasn't just territory, it was a threat of annihilation. To the west, Welsh kingdoms shifted between uneasy ally and sudden enemy. And in the north, a rising Scottish power watched the chaos below, waiting for a moment of weakness. Nothing was stable. Borders shifted like the tide. Burned towns smoldered where farms had stood only days before. Treaties mattered less than the weather. And at the center of this collapsing chessboard stood the House of Wessex. The dynasty Æthelstan was born into, holding the line by its fingertips. Every heir mattered. Every succession was a gamble. One assassination, one failed battle, one sickly prince, and everything Alfred the Great had built would disintegrate. The House of Wessex did not rise because it was the strongest dynasty. It rose because it was the one that survived. Viking armies burned their fields, shattered their nobles, wiped out neighboring kingdoms. Every generation of Wessex rulers faced a moment when the dynasty's survival hung by a thread. At more than one point, the entire bloodline came within a single death of extinction. Adapt or disappear, that became the law. Villages that once collapsed in a single night were reforged into fortified burhs. Stone and earth fortresses that turned open farmland into traps for Viking warbands. Raiders who expected easy plunder found themselves cornered, isolated, and crushed. This wasn't administration. It was evolution driven by fear. Wessex reorganized its levies, tightened its laws, rewrote its alliances, and hardened its identity. Kings and bishops stood shoulder to shoulder. Mercia, weakened and desperate, became a crucial, if unpredictable, partner in survival. Every reform was a shield, every alliance a gamble. But even with stronger walls and new armies, nothing was stable. A sudden illness, a misplaced arrow, a failed campaign, any of these could have ended the royal line and erased the fragile idea of a united Anglo-Saxon resistance. And into this hunted, hardened dynasty, a boy was born. A child who would inherit not only their reforms and their ambitions, but also their enemies, their unfinished battles, and their impossible expectations. A boy who would grow up knowing that the survival of an entire people might one day depend on him. Alfred the Great reshaped the destiny of Britain. He halted Viking conquest, rebuilt learning, and laid the foundations of a unified kingdom. To later generations, he became more myth than man, the philosopher king, the wise reformer, the savior of Wessex. But legends cast long, dangerous shadows. Because the enemies Alfred defeated did not vanish, they adapted. And every rival who could not break Alfred's armies now turned their ambitions toward something more vulnerable, his bloodline. That meant Æthelstan. From the moment he was born, he stepped into a world already expecting a savior, already judging him against a ghost, and already circling with those who would prefer another heir. A boy raised inside a dynasty that was brilliant but divided. For beneath the glory of Alfred's legacy lay a quiet truth. The succession after his reign was far from secure. Multiple heirs, conflicting loyalties, a crown with more than one claimant. And those tensions wouldn't wait for Æthelstan to grow up. They would shape his childhood, fracture his alliances, and stalk him long before he ever touched a throne. Because when Alfred died, the fight over who would rule next did not elevate Æthelstan. It pushed him toward the edge. Æthelstan's father, Edward the Elder, did not inherit peace. He inherited a war still burning. Campaign after campaign, he pushed deep into the Midlands and the southeast, reclaiming fortresses long held by Norse warlords. Towns that had flown Viking banners for decades were forced back under West Saxon control. Every mile Edward recovered strengthened the kingdom, and created new enemies who would one day question his son's right to rule it. His closest and most formidable ally was his sister, Lady Æthelflæd of Mercia. Together, they forged a military partnership unmatched in their age. Mercian and West Saxon armies moved like two halves of one machine, fortifying boroughs, cutting off rebel lords, and rolling the frontier steadily eastward. To their enemies, it felt like an inevitability. Wessex and Mercia were becoming one power, but victory came with cracks. Every reclaimed territory brought a lord who had to be placated or watched. One Mercian ealdorman, furious that his authority was reduced after Edward's gains, refused to send troops and quietly began rallying support for an alternative heir. And he wasn't the only one. Monks whispered about rival princes. Noble families quietly chose sides, because inside Edward's growing household lay the deepest fracture of all. He had multiple sons from different marriages, each with powerful factions behind them. Advisors, nobles, even bishops were already aligning themselves with their preferred successor. The court was divided long before the crown was vacant. And for young Æthelstan, watching from the edges of power, every new fortress his father built was another rival he might one day have to face. When Æthelstan was born around 894, he was not simply a royal infant. He was a new political problem for an already fractured dynasty. Edward the Elder's court was packed with rival factions, each backing different potential heirs. Another son meant another contender, another claim, another threat, and not everyone welcomed his arrival. For some, the child's very existence complicated long-nurtured plans. For others, his survival was inconvenient. Then something unusual happened. Alfred the Great, the aging architect of England's survival, took a personal interest in the boy. Medieval sources hint that Alfred may have gifted Æthelstan a ceremonial sword, a cloak edged with royal trim, and weapons far too fine for a child. To some, these were symbols of grooming an heir. To others, they were sparks thrown into dry political kindling. Because Alfred's attention did not simply honor Æthelstan. It marked him. It singled him out in a court where being chosen by the king could be as dangerous as being ignored. Every gesture Alfred made toward the boy created whispers. Why him? Why now? Who does this threaten? From the beginning, Æthelstan's path was shaped not by childhood innocence, but by perceptions, rivalries, and ambitions far older than he was. He wasn't just born into a royal family. He was born into a battlefield, long before he ever touched a sword. Instead of being raised at his father's court, Æthelstan was sent away to Mercia, a choice that looked, to many, less like education and more like removal. Mercia was no passive refuge. Under Lady Æthelflæd, a formidable ruler in her own right, it was a rival center of power with its own ambitions and its own identity. Here, the young prince gained something no other West Saxon heir had: deep exposure to Mercian culture, military structure, and diplomacy. But in Wessex, this advantage looked dangerous. A prince shaped outside their influence could one day challenge the very nobles sworn to serve him. To some, he was becoming a bridge between two kingdoms. To others, he was becoming a problem. From a young age, Æthelstan learned that his greatest strengths, his alliances, his upbringing, his education, were also the very things that put a target on his back. His future as a unifying king quietly threatened the divided world he was born into. Edward the Elder had many children, and several younger sons backed by ambitious noble factions eager to shape England's future. As Æthelstan reached adulthood, the question of succession became not just uncertain, but dangerous. To some, Æthelstan was the ideal heir, a prince forged in Wessex yet sharpened in Mercia, carrying the rare potential to unite two kingdoms into one. To others, he was an obstacle, a threat to their influence, their families, and their vision of England. The rival princes became more than children. They became banners, weapons, symbols of competing futures, and behind the polished rituals of the royal court, a shadow war ignited. Secret alliances were forged. Faction leaders met under cover of darkness. Marriage offers and promises of land quietly circulated through noble halls. Everyone felt the tension tightening because Edward's strength was failing. His presence was the last wall holding back open conflict. And when the king died, that wall would collapse. The clock was about to start. Your highest impact version so far, ready for documentary use. When Edward the Elder died in 924, the fragile balance between Wessex and Mercia cracked instantly. Mercia moved first, proclaiming Æthelstan king before the old king's body was even cold. Wessex did not follow. It paused, hesitated, and whispered. Because in Wessex, another claimant was rising. Æthelfweard, younger, ambitious, and backed by powerful southern nobles who feared a Mercian-raised king, became the rallying point for a faction that wanted control, not unity. His supporters armed their household guards. Riders carried messages through the night. Some sources even hint at darker possibilities, plots to remove Æthelstan before momentum could gather behind him. The danger was no longer theoretical. It breathed at his door. For Æthelstan, the next months were a blur of tension and strategy. Advisors warned him not to travel alone. At night, he could see foreign banners gathering along the southern horizon, symbols of a brother who was becoming an enemy. For nearly a year, the realm trembled. Corridors filled with murmured warnings. Noble families weighed which prince they feared least. Every council meeting risked collapsing into violence. And through it all, Æthelstan carried the understanding that the throne he claimed could vanish with a single misstep. Mercia watched. Wessex waited. And England stood on the edge of a succession war that could erase the fragile Anglo-Saxon gains of the past generation. Sharper danger, deeper emotion, stronger character. Æthelstan navigated the succession crisis with remarkable restraint and constant risk. Every council meeting felt like a battlefield without swords. Some Wessex nobles arrived flanked by armed retainers. Others spoke in careful, measured tones, watching his every word for weakness. A single insult, a raised voice, even a suspicious pause could have triggered open revolt. Behind closed doors, Æthelstan worked relentlessly. He reassured nervous southern lords that he would not dismantle Wessex traditions. He reminded Mercian leaders that he was one of their own. And in several tense, late-night meetings, he faced nobles who had quietly backed Æthelfweard, speaking to them with a calm that belied the danger. He knew one miscalculation could end him, but no miscalculation came. By 925, the deadlock broke. Tension gave way not to peace, but to a grudging acceptance that only Æthelstan could hold the kingdom together. When the moment of coronation arrived at Kingston upon Thames, the hall was thick with unspoken fear. As Æthelstan stepped forward, witnesses later recalled how the room fell utterly silent. Even then, factions eyed one another across the chamber, hands resting on sword belts, waiting for the slightest signal. And then the crown touched his head. In that frozen second, everything hung in the balance. The fragile alliance, the scars of civil tension, the uncertain future of England itself. But when the silence finally broke, it wasn't with violence. It was with recognition. This was more than a coronation. It was the moment the old world of divided kingdoms ended, and a united England began. Æthelstan's authority was far from secure in the first years of his reign. Some nobles questioned whether a king raised partly in Mercia could truly be trusted. Others whispered that Mercian influence over the crown was dangerous, even unnatural. A few southern lords met in quiet chambers, gauging whether the new king could be challenged or replaced. Æthelstan understood the stakes. If he hesitated, the kingdom would fracture. If he pushed too hard, rebellion could ignite. So he acted with precision. He issued new law codes that emphasized justice, order, and royal oversight, not as mere reforms, but as declarations of power. These were laws meant to bind former rivals together under one crown. Every clause he proclaimed carried a double edge, stability on one side, the threat of revolt on the other. Then he summoned nobles from across England to shared councils. Such assemblies had rarely been unified before. The meetings were tense. Æthelstan studied the room carefully, noting who hesitated before pledging loyalty, who whispered behind their drinking cups, who arrived with large entourages that looked suspiciously like armed guards. He knew one wrong word could send powerful factions storming out, plunging the kingdom back into chaos. But day by day, council by council, the shape of a nation began to emerge. What started as suspicion slowly shifted toward recognition. The young king was not simply holding the pieces together. He was building something England had never seen before. A single, coherent kingdom governed by a ruler strong enough to defend it, and wise enough to bind it. One of Æthelstan's greatest strengths was his grasp of diplomacy, not as ceremony, but as warfare by other means. He understood that England's enemies did not all ride across its borders. Some wrote letters, forged marriages, and quietly built coalitions abroad. To survive, he had to play the same game and win. So Æthelstan began forging alliances across Europe, but each one carried risk. Continental rulers tested him, probing whether this young king was truly the equal of emperors and dukes. Some sent envoys with impossible demands. Others hinted at support while secretly entertaining rival offers. A single misjudged marriage could have dragged England into a foreign war or humiliated the crown. Still, Æthelstan moved with precision. He married his sisters into some of the most powerful courts on the continent, unions that signaled strength, but also placed England on a diplomatic razor's edge. Factions at home questioned these marriages, fearing foreign influence or retaliation. Yet Æthelstan pressed forward, calculating loyalties like pieces on a board. Ships crossed the channel bearing royal brides. Letters sealed with wax traveled between kingdoms, each carrying promises or veiled threats. And slowly, something extraordinary happened. England shifted from a regional kingdom to a central player in European politics. Foreign rulers now looked to Æthelstan for arbitration, support, and alliance. But elevation came with danger. Every new bond tied England closer to continental conflicts. Every agreement brought obligations that could explode into war. Diplomacy, for Æthelstan, was as perilous as the battlefield, and just as decisive. Continental chroniclers granted Æthelstan titles almost unheard of for an English king. Basilius, Emperor, Rex Totius Britanniae. These were not poetic embellishments. They were public acknowledgments that England had risen faster than anyone expected. And with every new title, the political map of Europe shifted uneasily. English envoys now appeared at courts from Francia to the German realms. Foreign princes sought asylum at Æthelstan's side, a risky move that could spark international outrage. Gifts and relics crossed the channel in glittering processions, but behind the ceremony lay competition. Every alliance he forged risked provoking another ruler. Every artifact he accepted signaled a shift in loyalty someone else might resent. Not all were pleased. Some continental kings whispered that England's young monarch was reaching too far, too fast. Others tested him with demands, probing for weakness. Even at home, a few nobles wondered whether their king's rising fame would bring England prosperity, or drag them into conflicts far beyond their shores. Yet Æthelstan navigated this rising tide of ambition and suspicion with remarkable precision. He read letters like battlefields, measured courts like chessboards, and leveraged his growing prestige without overstepping, a balance as delicate as any siege line. Through careful maneuvering, England did not just gain honor, it claimed a seat at the center of European politics. Glory, but glory earned in the shadow of danger. The northern frontier was more than a political challenge for Æthelstan. It was the fault line on which his entire vision for England could fracture. Norse warlords still ruled the city of York, their emissaries sending veiled threats southward. Scottish rulers watched the border like hawks, ready to seize advantage at the slightest weakness. And in Strathclyde, resentment smoldered, kept alive by raids, reprisals, and memories of old injustices. Controlling the southern and midland shires meant little if Northumbria remained unstable. The north was the hinge of Britain, a region where cultures clashed, alliances shifted overnight, and kingship itself could be questioned. Traders whispered of Viking ships gathering in secret harbors. Border villages reported sudden attacks in the dark. Even some Northumbrian nobles resisted Æthelstan's claim, unsure whether to trust him or defy him. Æthelstan knew that securing Northumbria would demand more than diplomacy. It would require a confrontation, one that could either unite Britain under a single crown or plunge the island back into chaos. In 927, a rare and dangerous opportunity emerged. Sihtric, the Norse king of York, died suddenly, an event that cracked open a region usually locked behind Viking shields. But the vacuum he left was unstable. Rival claimants maneuvered in the shadows, warbands rallied around surviving Norse nobles, and rumors spread of fierce resistance if an outsider tried to seize the throne. Æthelstan moved with astonishing speed. He weighed the risks. A rushed campaign could trigger a Norse uprising. Waiting could allow a new Viking coalition to form. But hesitation was more perilous than action. Within days, he mobilized a disciplined army, coordinating scouts, supply lines, and trusted northern allies who knew the terrain. As Æthelstan marched toward York, tension thickened. Smoke rose from signal fires. Villages braced for conflict. The city itself pulsed with uncertainty, its narrow streets filled with armed men, its leaders divided between defiance and fear. When English banners appeared on the horizon, the air crackled with the possibility of ambush. Yet Æthelstan advanced with confidence and calculation. His presence, reinforced by the order of his ranks, convinced enough of York's leaders that resisting him could mean the city's ruin. One by one, gates opened, weapons lowered. The city yielded, not through brute force but through Æthelstan's timing, authority, and command of the moment. When York fell under his control, it was more than a political shift. It was the moment England, for the first time in recorded history, stood united under a single monarch, a fragile, hard-won unity forged through strategy, nerve, and impeccable judgment. After securing York, Æthelstan moved quickly to consolidate this fragile new order. He carefully orchestrated a great summit at Emont Bridge, choosing a location neutral enough to avoid insult, but close enough to his power to remind everyone who now commanded Britain's center. He summoned the kings of Scotland, Strathclyde, and several Welsh rulers, men who had long resisted English influence. When they arrived, the tension was unmistakable. Riders waited at a distance, hands resting on hilts. Messengers moved between camps in uneasy silence. And during the negotiations, the northern rulers exchanged cautious glances, each measuring Æthelstan's strength and wondering how far his reach truly extended. At the ceremony, they acknowledged his overlordship. A historic moment, the British Isles briefly unified under one dominant king. But the submission was fragile. Behind the ritual bows and formal pledges, resentment simmered like a banked fire. Whispers spread through the camps, hints of future alliances, and plans for a day when Æthelstan might falter. He had won recognition, but he knew it could evaporate with a single miscalculation. Consolidating Britain was not just a triumph, it was a delicate balancing act, and the next move would determine whether unity endured or shattered. The Emont Agreement brought a moment of calm, but beneath the surface, Britain felt like a continent waiting for a spark. In the halls of northern courts, whispers traveled faster than messengers. Scottish advisers questioned how long Æthelstan's power would reach. Strathclyde nobles murmured that their autonomy was slipping away. In York, former Norse loyalists gathered in shadowed taverns, testing each rumor for signs of rebellion. Scotland, Strathclyde, and York were not passive territories. They were living political worlds with their own rivalries, loyalties, and fears. Now all three watched Æthelstan with growing unease. His southern reforms, his expanding councils, his tightening grip on law and tribute, they read them not as unity but as absorption. Æthelstan sensed the tension. Reports from envoys grew sharper, more urgent. Northern musters forming, border lords meeting in secret, alliances shifting like sand. He knew the peace was brittle, a thin layer over old fractures. Any miscalculation, a harsh law, a disputed border, even a rumor of favoritism, could shatter it. And in the distance, a greater threat loomed. Viking factions hungry to reclaim lost power, waiting for the exact moment England tore itself apart. Æthelstan faced a truth few kings ever grasp. Conquering Britain was only the beginning. Keeping it united might demand far more. While tensions simmered across Britain, Æthelstan was building something far more fragile and far more revolutionary than a battlefield victory. He was crafting one of the most sophisticated administrations medieval Europe had ever seen. But it did not come easily. Charters were standardized only after long debates in royal councils, where proud nobles bristled at losing local autonomy and scribes argued over every line of legal phrasing. Candlelit halls shook with heated voices. Bishops pushed for moral laws, merchants demanded fairness in trade, and border lords insisted their privileges not be erased. Æthelstan navigated these competing interests with relentless focus. Scribes worked late into the night, ink staining their fingers as they drafted new legal codes. Church leaders advised, questioned, and sometimes resisted, forcing the king to balance spiritual authority with political necessity. Yet slowly, through negotiation, pressure, and vision, England began to function as a single organism, its laws harmonized, its administration interconnected. It was a delicate creation, a unified kingdom stitched together by paper, prayer, and persuasion. And Æthelstan knew that if he faltered, if any region sensed weakness or inequality, the entire structure could unravel just as quickly as it formed. Despite Æthelstan's administrative brilliance, the North was turning dangerous. Olaf Guthfrithson, ambitious, ruthless, and backed by the power networks of Dublin and Northumbria, plotted to reclaim York. Constantine II of Scotland nursed a long resentment, seeing Æthelstan not as a unifier, but as a southern overlord constraining his ambition. Strathclyde's rulers, pressured by both giants, watched for any chance to shift the balance. Across the Irish Sea, war councils whispered by torchlight. Messengers rode through storm-beaten passes. Viking ships quietly gathered in hidden inlets. Every sign pointed to the same truth. A coalition was forming, one designed to crush England's rising power, and Æthelstan knew it. Scouts brought reports in the dead of night. Courtiers unfurled maps across his table, inked lines showing fleets, alliances, and looming danger. The king studied each letter, each omen, understanding that one wrong decision could ignite a conflict that would test the unity he had spent a lifetime building. Northumbria was the last great unsolved problem of Anglo-Saxon England. For over a century, Norse lords, Irish sea war chiefs, and old Northumbrian dynasties had battled for control of York, each victory and defeat shaking the stability of the entire island. It was a land divided by culture, language, and long memory, where allegiance shifted as quickly as the tides on its rugged coast. When Æthelstan inherited this challenge, danger was already rising. Scouts reported skirmishes along the borders. Local lords held secret meetings in firelit halls. Rumors of Viking banners gathering near the Humber drifted south. The streets of York grew tense, its markets filled with whispers about whether the young king could truly hold the north. Æthelstan felt the weight of every message, every warning. He studied maps by candlelight, aware that England's unity depended on what happened here. To prevail, he would need more than armies. He would need diplomacy, trust, and the resolve to confront a region where kings rarely died peacefully. As news spread that Sitric Keech was dead, Northumbria teetered on the edge of anarchy. Æthelstan moved instantly. His banners rose outside York as rival lords argued over whether to resist or submit. One wrong move could plunge the region back into chaos. But with calm resolve and overwhelming discipline, Æthelstan secured the city, marking the first true unification of England. At Emont Bridge, kings who rarely met without swords gathered under Æthelstan's gaze. Suspicion crackled between Welsh, Scots, and northern lords, each watching the others for betrayal. Æthelstan stepped forward, commanding the moment with calm authority. Through sharp words and sharper diplomacy, he bound them to peace, securing unity not by force, but by sheer strategic will. Resentment smoldered beneath the new peace. Constantine II met Æthelstan with courteous words, yet held secret councils by torchlight, plotting with wary nobles. In the Welsh hills, messengers slipped between fortresses carrying whispers of resistance. And across the Irish Sea, Norse warbands tested their ships in the moonlit surf, preparing for a chance to strike. Scouts arrived at Æthelstan's hall breathless, northern musters forming, foreign envoys moving under cover of night, coded messages passing through shadowed ports. The king felt the pressure tightening. Unity was fragile. One spark could ignite a chain of rebellions. But Æthelstan did not panic. He watched, calculated, and prepared, knowing the coming crisis would demand more than diplomacy. It would demand a kingdom ready to withstand the gathering storm. Instead of striking first, Æthelstan chose patience. Across his kingdom, the work of quiet transformation began. In the burhs, carpenters hammered through dawn as walls rose higher under the watch of armored sentries. In royal workshops, furnaces roared while minters struck bright new coinage, each piece a symbol of order in uncertain times. And in monastic halls, scribes bent over parchment by candlelight, copying laws, treaties, and charters that would bind the realm together. Every reform strengthened the backbone of England. Trade routes reopened, courts grew more disciplined, and local reeves enforced justice with new authority. Yet this progress unfolded under constant pressure. Northern lords watched uneasily, and far-off Viking fleets lingered like hungry shadows on the horizon. Æthelstan felt the weight of it all. He knew these efforts were more than logistics. They were the foundation of a nation he intended to outlast every rival. With each fortified gate and freshly inked charter, he built not just defenses but a future. The storm was approaching, but when it came, England would be ready. What set Æthelstan apart from earlier kings was his command of diplomacy far beyond Britain. He didn't simply send his sisters abroad. He placed them with precision. Each marriage was a calculated move, designed to bind England to rising continental powers and counter any attempt to isolate him. Envoys arrived at his court, draped in foreign silks and bearing gifts of gold, relics, and letters sealed with imperial wax. Some came seeking friendship, others came to measure England's strength. Behind ceremonial bows and polite smiles lay veiled threats, whispered warnings, and the unmistakable weight of European politics. Æthelstan met all of it with measured confidence, hosting feasts that dazzled guests, negotiating terms with quiet authority, and responding to probing questions with answers crafted to reveal nothing and suggest everything. Continental chroniclers began calling him Rex Totius Britanniae, King of all Britain, and even Basilius, a title that edged toward imperial dignity. Diplomacy became another battlefield. Every alliance he forged tightened the bonds of his kingdom, and every foreign recognition elevated England's prestige. Æthelstan wasn't just ruling a realm, he was positioning it on the world stage, ensuring that enemies at home and abroad understood the new reality. England had a king whose influence reached far beyond the sea. In the north, the results of Æthelstan's rule became impossible to ignore. Markets in York bustled again, merchants weighing silver coins, traders shouting prices, and ships sliding into the river docks heavy with wool, furs, and grain. Clergy moved more freely than they had in decades, carrying scrolls, relics, and letters between monasteries as they crossed mist-covered roads and snow-dusted hills. Even Norse nobles, once wary, gathered in mead halls debating whether integration with the English crown offered a safer future for their families. Æthelstan watched all of this carefully. He inspected rebuilt fortifications, consulted local leaders, and dispatched trusted envoys to settle disputes before they grew. Progress was real, but so were the dangers beneath it. Winter winds swept across the Northumbrian plains, whispering of uncertainty. Scouts brought word of unfamiliar ships spotted far out at sea. Messengers arrived from the Scottish border with hints of unease among Constantine's nobles. Rumors drifted through northern towns, quiet talk of rebellion, of alliances forming in the shadows. Stability had returned, but only by a thread, and Æthelstan understood better than anyone that the next storm was already gathering beyond the horizon. Rumors swept across Britain like wildfire. Scouts along the western coast reported dark silhouettes on the horizon, Viking ships gathering in Irish waters. Couriers arrived breathless, delivering word that Olaf Guthfrithson was rallying warriors to reclaim York. In the northern hills, lords whispered in torchlit halls, debating whether to stand with Æthelstan or bend to the rising Viking tide. Closer to York, the unease was palpable. Merchants paused mid-trade to watch unfamiliar riders pass along the roads. Local militias drilled nervously on frost-covered fields, gripping spears with white knuckles. Every village felt the weight of something approaching. Æthelstan felt it too, but he let neither fear nor haste dictate his decisions. Instead, he moved with deliberate, steely clarity. Troops drilled in the morning mist. Fortifications were inspected stone by stone. Supply lines were secured to support months, if not years, of conflict. His intelligence networks mapped every rumor, every alliance, every shifting current beyond the horizon. He carried the knowledge that one wrong move could unravel the unity he had spent a lifetime forging. But he also knew this. England had never been more prepared. Every action he took was measured not in months, but in decades, because the storm gathering beyond the sea was not just a threat to his crown. It was a test of everything England had become. By 937, the Great Coalition was no longer rumor, it was reality. Olaf Guthfrithson's longships left Dublin's harbors in black, heaving waves. Constantine II marched his hardened Scottish infantry south, their banners snapping in the cold wind. From the west came Owain of Strathclyde, leading cavalry known for their brutal charges across narrow river crossings. Three forces, three kingdoms, one purpose: destroy Æthelstan and tear the English state back into fragments. Such an alliance had never before marched on a single English king. Villages watched torchlit columns snake across the hills. Scouts returned with breathless reports of fleet movement and enemy encampments spreading like wildfire across the northern landscape. War drums echoed in places that had not heard them for generations. Yet Æthelstan did not waver. He rode the ridge lines himself, studying the land, valleys that could funnel enemy troops, rivers that could slow them, hills that could shatter their formations. He knew that his army was smaller, but discipline and precision were his weapons. Every town, every ford, every stone wall became part of a strategy only he could see. But the stakes were stark. One wrong decision, and England would die in a single season. So with calm resolve, and the weight of a united kingdom on his shoulders, Æthelstan prepared his army. He would not wait behind walls. He would strike first, strike hard, and meet the greatest coalition in British history head-on. The fate of England would be written on the battlefield. Æthelstan summoned warriors from Wessex, Mercia, and every corner of his New England. Dust rose as thousands marched, armor clanking, banners snapping in the wind. At the front, the king reminded them this was a fight for England's very survival. Behind the lines, families prayed. Ahead lay the field that would shape history. Brunanburh. The sun glinted off dented armor as men fought through mud, shields splintered and banners torn. Smoke stung the air, steel clashed like thunder. Æthelstan's left flank wavered, but he rode forward, rallying them with a shout. Across the field, Anlaf and Constantine pressed hard, desperate to break the line. Neither side yielded, yet the tide was about to turn. Æthelstan rode behind the buckling shield wall, his cloak streaked with dust, voice cutting through smoke and screams. Spears clashed, shields splintered. Mud swallowed boots. A thane staggered under a crushing blow. Æthelstan shouted him back into the fight. Across the field, Anlaf's warriors surged again, desperate and roaring. The king scanned the chaos, hunting the moment the enemy line might finally break. Spears thrust through narrow gaps. Some men fell instantly, others staggered and fought on. War in the 10th century was intimate, violent, suffocating. Every step forward meant stepping over the dead. On the English right flank, housecarls swung axes in wide, brutal arcs while javelins hissed overhead, shattering shields and breaking momentum. The air reeked of blood, sweat, and smoke. Mud and gore clung to boots. Æthelstan scanned the line, ready to reinforce any weakness, knowing a single breach could unravel the fate of England. Sensing the English right gaining ground, Anlaf hurled a hidden reserve of hardened veterans into the fray. They smashed into the advancing line with brutal force, shields splintering, axes biting into wood and flesh, mud spraying as the ranks buckled. For a breathless moment, the battlefield teetered. A lone housecarl staggered but held, buying precious seconds. Yet Æthelstan's gaze stayed sharp. Amid the chaos, he spotted a weakness, a gap in the enemy flank. Here he sensed the tide could turn. Rather than hurling his entire reserve into the faltering right, Æthelstan acted with surgical precision. He released only his finest troops, housecarls and elite thanes, charging in a disciplined surge. Steel rang against steel. Axes carved arcs through the air. Shields splintered as the enemy recoiled a few precious steps, giving the English line room to breathe. Many commanders would have panicked, overcommitted, lost the battle. Æthelstan did not. One miscalculation could collapse the entire front, but he stayed calm, calculating, exact. He anticipated Anlaf's gambit as part of something larger, and he was right. The tide of battle was beginning to shift. On the opposite flank, Constantine II unleashed his warriors in a crushing charge. Claymores swung, shields shattered, mud sprayed as the Scots slammed into the English left with brutal force. For a moment, the line buckled, men stumbling over fallen comrades, struggling to hold against the weight of the surge. Across the field, the coordination between Anlaf and Constantine was unmistakable. This was no chaotic melee. It was a calculated, two-pronged strike meant to break Æthelstan's army in one decisive blow. Æthelstan's gaze swept the left. He saw the pressure, measured the danger, and began calculating his next move. Every heartbeat, every decision, could determine England's fate. Yet the English left did not break. Thanes shouted commands as shields splintered and axes crashed down. Clangs of metal echoed across the mud-soaked field. Blood mixed with sweat and grime. Shield walls reformed under pressure, like timber frames reforged after a storm. Mercian veterans, grandsons of warriors who once fought under Alfred the Great, held firm. Mud clung to their boots. Their arms trembled with effort. Still they pushed forward, each strike met with another, each heartbeat a fight for survival. Constantine's momentum slowed, then stalled. The line held. From horseback, Æthelstan watched, nodding once. Every man's effort mattered, and every heartbeat kept England alive. The battlefield center dissolved into pure chaos. Bodies piled high, forcing warriors to step over friend and foe alike. Mud sucked at boots. Blood slicked the ground. Men slipped, rose, crashed together again. Steel clanged in the fog of sweat and smoke. The air stank of iron, ash, and fear. Shouts blurred with the screams of the dying. A thane stumbled over a corpse, barely twisting aside as a Norse axe tore through the space where his skull had been. Mud, blood, steel. Men fell, men rose, shields splintered. The center held barely. Through the haze, Æthelstan watched everything. His gaze tracked the pressure on the left, the Scots hammering forward, and Anlaf poised for the killing blow. He calculated every movement, every shift in momentum. He sensed the storm before it broke, and he knew the moment to strike was almost here. Fresh ranks of Danes, Scots, and Norse slammed into the English center. Steel rang, shields split, mud and blood sprayed under pounding boots. A thane blocked a brutal strike, arm numb, breath sharp, but fought on. The line wavered. The battle teetered. Æthelstan watched the chaos tightening, sensing the moment he'd have to act. Æthelstan surged into the melee, not as a distant commander, but as a king willing to bleed beside his men. Steel roared around him. Dust and blood swirled. A Norseman charged. Æthelstan struck him down. Every step was a risk. Yet the troops roared his name, the line steadied, courage surged, the battle bent toward victory. The coalition line buckled. Shields rattled, axes clanged, men slid on mud and blood. A Norse warrior stumbled, creating a widening gap as others surged ahead. The wall fractured. Coordination died. Æthelstan saw it instantly, every stumble, every opening. The enemy was exposed, and he knew exactly where to strike next. The moment had arrived. Æthelstan raised his hand. Commanders leaned in. Formations tightened. Spears dipped. Dust swirled around armored boots. Blood-dark mud clung to greaves. The air reeked of sweat, iron, and smoke. Even the wind seemed to pause. Mercian veterans gripped their shields harder. Their eyes flicked to the king, waiting, ready, coiled like springs. Across the field, the coalition's last great push was slowing, strains showing, lines stretching thin. Æthelstan saw everything, and he knew exactly what came next. He moved. The battle was about to shift. The moment had arrived. Æthelstan lifted his hand. Commanders leaned forward. Formations tightened. Spears dipped. Breath held. Dust swirled around armored boots. Pale sunlight flashed off steel. The air stank of sweat, blood, and smoke. Silence stretched thin as a drawn bowstring. Mercian veterans gripped their shields harder, eyes locked on their king. Muscles tensed. Every man coiled, waiting for the spark that would turn chaos into order. Across the field, the coalition's last great surge faltered. Their lines wavered. Their rhythm broke. Æthelstan saw the weakness, felt the momentum shift, knew exactly where to strike. He moved. And when he did, the enemy would feel the full weight of England. The battlefield was a smear of churned mud, shattered shields, and bodies locked in desperate struggle. Steel clattered. Axes cracked. Smoke and dust mixed with the thick scent of blood. Mud squelched beneath every step. In the center of the chaos, Æthelstan stood poised, calm in the eye of the storm. His presence steadied the wavering line. Shields lifted. Spears aligned. Breath held. A Mercian veteran tightened his grip on his axe, meeting his king's gaze for a heartbeat. In Æthelstan's eyes he saw courage, unshakable, immovable, and felt his own fear harden into resolve. Across the field, the coalition surged. Norse, Danes, and Scots pressing forward, their lines stretched thin, momentum high but fragile. Warriors overextended. Gaps widened. Control slipped. Æthelstan saw it, felt the shift. The pendulum was moving, men braced. The moment was coming, and when it arrived, England would strike. It began with a simple gesture, a raised sword, trumpets blared, orders rippled down the line, boots shifted, axes lowered, spears leveled, dust whipped into eyes. Shields clanged as men braced. A young thane grinned, knuckles white around his spear. An older housecarl bellowed a roar that cut through the din. Hearts pounded, muscles tightened. Every man leaned forward. Axes rose, spears jabbed. The line surged. Forward, forward, forward. Mud flew beneath their boots. The ground trembled under their unified charge. Across the battlefield, coalition lines wavered, stretched thin, unprepared for the sudden shock of disciplined, furious momentum driving straight into their heart. England was no longer holding. England was striking. The English center slammed forward with a thunderous roar. This was no reckless charge, it was a disciplined, coordinated advance. Shields locked, spears braced. Every step was calculated, every movement drilled into muscle and memory. Steel clashed, spears splintered. Mud sucked at boots. Men stumbled, shouted, collided. The ground trembled beneath the weight of ordered fury. Across the coalition line, chaos erupted. Warriors who had marched shoulder to shoulder now found themselves out of position, too far ahead, too far behind, gaps widening with every heartbeat. A young thane stumbled over a fallen comrade, caught himself, then surged forward again, eyes fixed on the king who led them. Æthelstan had seized the initiative, and across the battlefield the consequences were immediate. Lines faltered, flanks wavered. The coalition's grand assault, its greatest push, was beginning to fracture. Here is an even sharper, more immersive, more cinematic enhancement of your section, pushing all the strengths while amplifying sensory detail, microstakes, and pacing exactly where you wanted it. On the English left, Æthelstan's quiet reinforcement began to show its power. What had seemed like collapse only minutes before now solidified into a wall of iron and conviction. Mercian veterans locked shields, their axes rising and falling in brutal rhythm. They fought with the weight of generations, grandsons of men who had stood with Alfred the Great, unwilling to yield a single inch of England's soil. Axes slammed against shields, spears thrust, mud flew beneath pounding boots. Every clash echoed across the field. Across from them, the Scots felt the shift. A young warrior stumbled, catching himself against a comrade as the press of English steel forced them back. Alarm flickered through their ranks. What had been a fierce advance was now a desperate struggle to hold ground. The line stiffened, shields locked. The Mercian push intensified. Step by step, the Scots yielded, slowly at first, then unmistakably. And as they fell back, coalition morale rippled. A crack in the line, a faltering momentum. The first domino had fallen. Meanwhile, on the English right, Anlaf's earlier gains evaporated. His Norse reserves were exhausted, their initial fury spent. Against the disciplined and now advancing English ranks, their cohesion withered. Their once tight formation opened like cracks in ice. Æthelstan's commanders saw this weakness and pressed harder. The battlefield dynamic had changed. The hunters were now being hunted. Sensing disaster closing in, Anlaf and Constantine roared commands over the chaos. Their voices cracked through smoke and shouting, desperately trying to pull collapsing lines back into shape. For a fleeting moment, pockets of fierce resistance flared, grizzled warriors planting their feet in churned mud, refusing to retreat even an inch. Shields splintered, spears clanged, boots slipped in blood-soaked earth. Men screamed orders, curses, prayers, anything to steady themselves. A young Norse fighter blinked through sweat and grit, stunned by the force of the English advance. A Mercian veteran beside him tightened his grip and pushed forward, sensing the coming break. But the truth hammered harder than any blade. They were losing momentum. They were losing ground. They were losing the battle's rhythm. The entire coalition line quivered like something about to snap. Æthelstan felt the shift first, a spark catching on dry tinder, racing across the field before anyone could stop it. This was the moment he had carved toward from the first clash, All the pressure, all the endurance, all the discipline, now ready to erupt. The spark was alive, and the fire was coming. Soon it would sweep the battlefield. Then, at the exact heartbeat, the coalition began to buckle. Æthelstan unleashed his mounted troops. They weren't heavy lancers meant for a grand charge. They were light, fast, precise. A scalpel, not a hammer. Hooves pounded through churned mud. The ground trembled. Riders burst from the flanks with brutal speed. Dust and debris spiraled around them as steel flashed in the afternoon sun. The first impact hit like a sudden storm. The cavalry struck. Spears shattered. Men scattered. A Norse archer dropped his arrow in panic as a rider thundered toward him. Another stumbled, trampled before he could raise his shield. Retreating units tried to reform, only to be sliced apart. Mercian infantry saw the riders sweep forward and roared approval, rallying harder into the collapsing line. This wasn't a charge. It was a precision strike, coordinated to tear open every weak point. The cavalry harassed fleeing pockets, cut down isolated fighters, and ripped through the coalition's vulnerable archers. Every edge they touched widened the cracks in the enemy front. Every sweep deepened the chaos. Every moment brought the coalition closer to breaking. The final collapse was no longer coming. It was beginning. With both flanks buckling under English pressure, Æthelstan turned his focus to the center, the battlefield's beating heart. He raised his hand, gave the signal, and the English line surged forward with renewed fury. Shouts rose, shields slammed, spears drove like iron rain. Then, finally, it happened. A section of the coalition center buckled, then broke. The line didn't bend, it snapped. A gaping void ripped open, splitting the battlefield in two. Shields shattered. Spears clattered to the ground. Mud and blood churned beneath slipping boots. Men screamed, fell, scrambled for footing as the collapse rippled outward. A veteran Norseman staggered backward, eyes wide with disbelief. English thanes felt the shift instantly, gripping axes tighter, roaring as they poured into the breach. The line broke. Men scattered. Chaos spread. Momentum shifted and could never shift back. Once the center gave way, the battle's fate was sealed. Æthelstan had forced the breakthrough he'd been building toward for hours. Chaos washed across the battlefield. Units that had once moved as one were now isolated and exposed. Commanders shouted orders, but their voices vanished into the roar of clashing steel and the thick clouds of dust swirling between the lines. Bloodied warriors stumbled through mud, eyes stinging, fighting more by instinct than vision. Shouts mixed with screams. Shields splintered. Boots slipped in the churned ground. Panic took root. A Norse veteran tried to rally his men, raising his sword, bellowing for them to stand, but the line was gone. A Mercian thane tightened his grip on his axe, a fierce grin spreading across his face. He felt it. Everyone did. The collapse had begun. Chaos spread. Lines broke. Men scattered. Commands went unheard. Æthelstan saw the opening and seized it instantly. He ordered a full advance across the line. The coalition's fate was sealed. Only desperate resistance remained. Battles aren't won only by strength and steel. They're won by psychology. The coalition, exhausted from its earlier assault, now watched the English surge forward with terrifying resolve. Cries pierced the smoke-choked air. Mud clung to boots. Shields splintered under the weight of the advance. Dust and ash stung eyes already burning with sweat. Warriors looked around in disbelief, comrades falling, lines bending, leaders overwhelmed. Panic crept in like cold water seeping through armor. A young Norseman froze, spear slipping from his grasp as those beside him turned to run. A Scottish warrior hesitated, glancing toward the left flank, only to find it hollowed out, collapsing into chaos. They faltered, they wavered, they broke. Retreat was no longer a choice, it was instinct. A sense of inevitability settled over the field. The stage was set. Æthelstan's final push would decide history. At last, Æthelstan's strategy unleashed its full force. The English advance swept the coalition backward. Spears sank into mud. Horses slipped. Screams of retreating warriors tore through smoke and dust. The ground trembled beneath the surge. Men stumbled, shields shattered, formations broke. The coalition teetered. A Norse veteran staggered away, axe raised in desperation as English thanes stormed past. A Scottish infantryman froze mid-step, unsure where safety lay, watching his comrades scatter around him. Æthelstan rode forward, armor darkened with grime and blood, his voice rising above the din. He saw the cracks widening, morale breaking, the enemy unraveling in real time. The rout had begun. Only courage and chaos stood between Æthelstan and history, and yet one final phase remained. The cracks widened slowly, then unmistakably, until the inevitable happened. The rout began, not sudden, not dramatic, but creeping. One unit peeled away, then another. Then a full section turned and ran as the English advance swallowed their ground. Shouts of retreat ripped through the smoke. Metal clanged. Mud sucked at boots. Dust stung eyes. Warriors stumbled over fallen comrades, tripping through chaos as fear surged like a shockwave. A Scottish soldier dropped his spear, breath hitching as he watched his line dissolve. A Norse veteran hesitated, gripping his axe, trying to rally, but no one followed. Lines broke. Units scattered, panic spread. Fear became survival, and still Æthelstan held his army steady. He signaled restraint, hold the line. Not yet. Not a reckless chase. Precision mattered more than speed. A disciplined pursuit would destroy the coalition far more thoroughly than a wild one. The battlefield had entered its final, decisive phase, one where panic ruled, exhaustion crushed resolve, and only those who maintained order would decide history. Æthelstan intended to be that order. Even as the rout tore through the coalition ranks, Anlaf Guthfrithson refused to yield. He spurred his horse through the chaos, shouting orders, trying to force shattered units back into line. Dust clouded the air. Spears clattered against shields. Horses skidded in churned mud. The cries of fleeing warriors cut through the deafening clash. A Norse fighter staggered past him, eyes wild, breath ragged. Another dropped his shield and ran. Still, Anlaf scraped together a handful of loyal men and formed a desperate knot of resistance on a low rise overlooking the field. If he could slow the English, just for a moment, some of his army might escape total annihilation. But every order he barked met only hesitation. Every attempt to reform the line revealed how broken it had become. And all the while, the English advanced with cold, relentless discipline. Anlaf had wagered everything on this battle. Now, as the tide surged against him, the cost of that gamble closed in from all sides. Here is a strengthened critique plus an even more cinematic, immersive, enhanced version of your passage. Sharper pacing, richer sensory detail, and deeper emotional stakes while preserving historical accuracy. Not cowardice, not surrender, but preservation. This frames Constantine as a leader thinking several moves ahead. It avoids portraying him as weak and instead presents him as responsible and politically aware. If his army was destroyed here, Scotland's defenses would be fatally weakened. This keeps the audience emotionally invested. The danger feels personal, national, and immediate. It would shape Anglo-Scottish relations for decades. By showing the ripple effects of the battle, you make the moment feel like a hinge point of history, not just the end of a fight. Even a retreat has sound, movement, and atmosphere. Add battlefield texture. Smoke drifting over bodies, iron taste in the air, exhausted men gasping, retreat turning into a physical struggle. One or two tiny, vivid soldier moments add authenticity. A Highlander trembling but refusing to drop his sword. A commander screaming for order that never comes. Short sentences equals tension. Choppy pacing can mimic the psychological fracture of a retreat. Æthelstan remains dominant, but Constantine is still dignified. This creates dual respect, crucial for narrating complex medieval politics. Further north, Constantine II of Scotland faced a crisis of his own. His warriors, valiant, exhausted, were being pushed back in scattered clusters. Smoke rolled across the hillside. Broken shields lay half buried in mud. The cries of retreating Highlanders echoed through the haze. Constantine felt the weight of the moment. If his army shattered here, Scotland's defenses would crumble. If even a portion survived, the kingdom could fight again. The choice formed like a blade in his mind. Retreat, not cowardice, not surrender, preservation. He called to his captains, gathering those who still heeded him. Some men resisted, wanting one last stand. Others fled without looking back. A young Highlander clutched his sword with shaking hands, torn between honor and survival. Constantine forced the withdrawal toward higher ground, step by step, refusing to let retreat become collapse. Yet every backward movement only revealed how fully Æthelstan commanded the field. This was survival, painful, necessary, and a decision that would shape the future of Britain for decades to come. Here's an even sharper, more immersive and battle-tightened enhanced version, pulling the sensory detail, pacing, and tactical tension even harder while keeping it historically grounded and YouTube-safe. Having ruptured the coalition line, Æthelstan advanced, not recklessly but with razor precision. He knew the danger. A retreating enemy left alone could regroup, reform, and strike back. But pressure applied at the perfect moment could break them completely. Orders rippled outward: hold the shield wall tight, push in measured steps, strike only when formation allowed. No frenzy, no overreach. Spears rattled, mud clung to boots. Dust burned eyes and lungs. The shouts of fleeing warriors rolled across the churned battlefield like a fading storm. Individual faces flashed through the chaos. A Thane smeared blood from his visor, jaw clenched, axe ready. A former Norse captive fighting for Æthelstan tightened his grip on his spear, a grim smile forming as he watched men who once enslaved him scatter. The English moved as one body, steady, relentless. Every gap widened, every hesitation exploited. The coalition staggered, panic turning to collapse. Æthelstan judged every second too fast and his lines would break apart, too slow and the enemy might regroup. His timing held perfect, a balance of discipline and instinct few commanders ever achieved. Ahead, the hill where Anlaf had tried, desperately, to reform his warriors loomed in the smoky haze. The final reckoning was moments away. Below is an upgraded, sharper, more cinematic, and even more psychologically tense version of your section, pushing sensory detail, micro moments, pacing and foreshadowing harder while keeping historical credibility and narrative focus. The English reached Anlaf's defensive knot and slammed into the fiercest resistance of the day. A circle of hardened veterans braced on the hillside, shields locked, breaths ragged. Sweat stung their eyes. Mud clung to their boots. The sun beat down on armor already scorching hot. Every motion demanded strength they barely had left. Steel crashed, axes chopped, blades scraped against splintering shields. The air vibrated with shouts, grunts, the smack of metal on bone. Inside the ring, individual battles flared. A Norse veteran ducked a sword swing and countered with a desperate knife thrust. Another shouted for comrades to hold, but each backward step cost precious ground. Fear mingled with fury in every face. Anlaf fought at the very front, refusing to retreat an inch. His strikes were wild but fueled by raw will. For a moment, just a heartbeat, the English advance slowed under the sheer intensity of the stand. But momentum was relentless. More English warriors pressed in from every angle, tightening their formations around the hill like a living vice. The defensive circle shrank, shields dipped, feet slipped, breathing grew shallow and frantic. Every fallen defender tightened the noose. Every inch surrendered brought the end closer. The final act of Brunanburh was about to begin. Here is an even more immersive, more dramatic, more sensory-rich upgraded version of your scene, pushing everything you highlighted. Micro-emotions, cinematic pacing, foreshadowing, and battlefield atmosphere. Despite their courage, the Norse shieldring could not hold. Fatigue gnawed at limbs. Breath came in ragged bursts. Mud caked boots. The stench of sweat, blood, and trampled earth hung thick in the smoke-choked air. A tiny gap opened just a sliver, then another. Shields dropped, bodies tumbled, the circle faltered. English axes surged in. The gap widened. The hill was lost. Some Norse fighters tried to flee down the slope, slipping on churned mud. Others stayed behind, buying precious seconds with their lives, swinging wildly, shouting final defiance, refusing to surrender even as the English pressed in. A Norse warrior stumbled, eyes wide with panic, only to be shoved aside by a relentless English thane driving forward with grim determination. Another clutched a dying comrade, torn between rage and the instinct to survive. Amid the chaos, Anlaf fought on, furious, exhausted, wounded. His strike slowed, his vision blurred. His commanders grabbed him, shouting over the din. He resisted, struggling to break free. But the battle was over. Reluctantly, heart burning, pride shattered, Anlaf allowed himself to be escorted away. His dream of reclaiming Northumbria died on the fields of Brunanburh. Around him, the coalition scattered. The English crown now stood unchallenged, the last obstacle broken. Æthelstan's vision of a united realm had come into being, its foundations sealed in blood and victory, destined to shape Britain's future. Here is an upgraded, more immersive, more dramatic, more sensory-rich version of your scene, pushing micro-emotions, pacing, terrain, sound, and long-term consequence exactly the way you indicated. With the coalition broken, the English began their pursuit, controlled, deliberate, relentless. They ran, they pushed, they shouted, panic spread. The English advanced. The Norse scattered, dust choked the air. Boots sank into churned earth. Sweat stung eyes. Every breath tasted of smoke and fear. Some Norse warriors stumbled over fallen comrades, scrambling back to their feet as others pulled them forward in desperate flight. One tripped, rolled, rose again, driven by instinct alone. Another froze for a heartbeat, staring at the English line closing behind him before bolting in terror. English thanes held their men steady. Keep formation. Left flank, advance. Don't break the line. Their shouts cut through the chaos, anchoring discipline amid the rising tide of momentum. Warriors advanced in waves, pressing fleeing enemies without losing cohesion. Every step was measured, every strike restrained. Æthelstan watched from higher ground, eyes narrowed against the swirling dust. His commands were calm, unwavering. Victory was his, but cruelty was not. Unnecessary slaughter would dishonor the victory and destabilize the realm he had fought so hard to shape. His orders reflected not just strategy but vision. And through that restraint he secured more than triumph on the field. He secured authority, order, a future no rival could challenge. The battle was ending, but Æthelstan's legacy was only beginning. As fleeing coalition forces scattered across the landscape, many converged on a nearby river, one of the few natural paths toward safety. But the riverbanks became scenes of chaos. Warriors pushed and crowded, trying to cross while still glancing back at the advancing English. Some were swept away by the current. Others dropped shields to swim faster. English skirmishers reached the bank moments later, launching arrows and javelins to disrupt mass crossings. For the coalition, it was another devastating bottleneck. For the English, it was the final act of battlefield control. Those who crossed would survive. Those who hesitated would not. As the final pockets of resistance fell, Æthelstan stood among his commanders and surveyed the field. The grass was torn, the soil soaked, shields splintered across the landscape. But amid the smoke and ruin, one reality became unmistakable. England had won a decisive, historic, and transformative victory. Æthelstan ordered the battlefield secured. Wounded men were tended to, English and coalition alike. Survivors among the enemy would be spared. The English king sought victory, not vengeance. The significance of the moment began to settle in. Brunanburh was not just a triumph in war, it was a statement, a declaration. The idea of a unified England had endured its greatest test and emerged triumphant. The world had changed. As darkness settled over Brunanburh, the English army began the grim task of counting the fallen. Lanterns flickered across the field as men searched for friends, rivals, and commanders. Victory had come at a price, one paid in sweat, exhaustion, and blood. Yet Æthelstan insisted that both English and coalition dead be treated with respect. Even his enemies, he believed, were warriors who deserved dignity in death. Chroniclers later wrote that the casualties were extraordinary: 5 kings, 7 earls, and countless warriors from the coalition lay on the ground. These numbers reflected more than a battlefield outcome. They represented the shattering of a political order. The coalition that sought to dismantle the English kingdom had been broken so completely that its leaders would require years, if ever, to rebuild their power. Æthelstan, surveying the lantern-lit field, understood the weight of the moment. England had survived its greatest trial, and now a new world was beginning to take shape. Suggested visuals: night shots of a battlefield with lanterns, soldiers carrying bodies, silhouettes of weary men walking through smoke, a close-up of Æthelstan's solemn expression. While much of the coalition army lay scattered behind them, survivors who escaped the battlefield began their long, painful retreats. Anlaf Guthfrithson fled toward the coast, slipping through the shadows with a handful of loyal retainers. His dream of ruling Northumbria had vanished in a single afternoon, and he carried with him the bitter knowledge that his alliance had failed. The defeat weakened his influence across the Irish Sea and drastically limited Viking ambitions in Britain for years to come. Constantine II withdrew north with the fragments of his Scottish host. Though he survived, the loss at Brunanburh left Scotland weakened and politically shaken. Strathclyde suffered as well. Its warriors had been decimated, and its king, Owain, retreated into a kingdom left vulnerable and exposed. Each leader carried the same realization: Anglo-Saxon England under Æthelstan was now the dominant force on the island, militarily, culturally, and diplomatically. Suggested visuals: footage of weary warriors traveling through rugged landscapes, coastlines at dusk, symbolic shots of abandoned shields, maps showing retreat paths north and west. In the days following the battle, Æthelstan faced an immediate strategic challenge: securing the north before any remnants of resistance could reorganize. He dispatched trusted commanders to patrol key routes, fortify river crossings, and reassert English authority over contested lands. York, always a focal point of Norse ambition, was placed under firm control with a blend of military presence and political negotiation. Local leaders who had once wavered were now eager to swear allegiance, recognizing that England's strength could no longer be doubted. Æthelstan's approach was pragmatic. Rather than rule through fear alone, he offered stability in exchange for loyalty. Law and order returned quickly to areas that had been unstable for decades. Trade routes reopened. Church officials and royal agents recorded settlements, distributed provisions, and documented oaths. The victory at Brunanburh was not just a military triumph. It became the foundation for long-term governance throughout the North. Suggested visuals: map animations of the North being secured, reenactments of oaths being sworn, shots of patrols crossing river fordings, atmospheric footage of early medieval York. Before Brunanburh, England was an idea, growing, promising, but fragile. After Brunanburh, England became real. Æthelstan's victory unified the Anglo-Saxon South, the Mercian heartlands, and the often contested territories of Northumbria into a single political entity backed by unprecedented military legitimacy. For the first time, chroniclers across Europe wrote openly of an English kingdom, with a scope and stability rivaling continental monarchies. Merchants and diplomats recognized the shift immediately. Trade increased, foreign envoys visited Æthelstan's court, and alliances strengthened. Stability brought prosperity. Towns fortified in earlier decades began to flourish. The king's reputation grew with each passing year, spreading from Frankish monasteries to the Carolingian courts. England was no longer merely resisting Viking invasions. It was influencing international affairs. The transformation was so profound that later historians would describe Æthelstan as the architect of a new political reality on the island of Britain. Suggested visuals: montage of bustling early medieval marketplaces, illuminated manuscripts with Anglo-Saxon imagery, gentle drone shots of rolling English landscapes, political maps showing England's unified shape. With peace regained, Æthelstan turned toward strengthening the internal structures of the kingdom. His legal reforms, some of the most sophisticated in Anglo-Saxon history, expanded earlier codes and refined the responsibilities of both nobles and commoners. He tackled issues like theft, debt, harboring criminals, and the obligations of military service. His laws emphasized accountability, moral conduct, and social order. These reforms were not abstract. Æthelstan traveled more than any king of his era, holding councils across the country to discuss local issues, confirm charters, and hear grievances. Each visit reinforced the idea of a centralized yet responsive monarchy. The king was not distant. He was present, active, and deeply invested in the lives of his subjects. Through these efforts, England's legal identity crystallized. Many principles introduced or expanded under Æthelstan would influence English governance for generations. Suggested visuals: footage of medieval councils, close-ups of hands writing in manuscripts, symbolic shots of a king riding between towns, scrolls and charters being sealed. Æthelstan's court became one of the leading intellectual centers in Europe. Scholars from the continent sought his patronage, attracted by the king's commitment to learning, literacy, and theological scholarship. Monks, scribes, diplomats, and poets filled his halls. Manuscripts produced during his reign were rich, complex, and beautifully illuminated, signs of a flourishing cultural environment. The king himself was unusually well-educated for his era. He valued precise language, legal consistency, and moral clarity. His charters displayed a remarkable blend of political insight and literary polish. Under his guidance, the clergy gained influence as guardians of knowledge, educators, and administrators who could help unify the kingdom through shared Christian identity. Æthelstan's cultural investment wasn't simply aesthetic. It was strategic. A literate court, a respected clergy, and connections to powerful European monasteries strengthened England's moral authority as well as its political prestige. Suggested visuals: bookmaking scenes, candle-lit scriptoria, monks writing on parchment, slow pan across illuminated manuscript pages, symbolic shots of travelers arriving at court. Even before Brunanburh, Æthelstan was known across Europe. After the battle, his prestige soared. Kings, dukes, and emperors sent envoys, gifts, and marriage offers. His sisters married into influential houses, linking England with Burgundy, West Francia, and the Holy Roman Empire. These alliances were not mere symbols. They were tools that strengthened trade, secured borders, and integrated England into the European political network. Foreign chroniclers praised Æthelstan with unusual enthusiasm. They described him as Basilius, a title echoing the Eastern Roman emperors, and Rex Totius Britanniae, the king of the whole island. Whether these titles were literal or ceremonial mattered less than the reality. England was now seen as a rising, confident power. Through diplomacy as much as warfare, Æthelstan positioned the English kingdom at the heart of continental politics. Suggested visuals: diplomatic envoys exchanging gifts, reenactments of royal marriages, medieval maps showing trade routes, manuscript-style depictions of kings writing letters. Religion played a major role in Æthelstan's statecraft. He sponsored monasteries, supported theological scholarship, and endowed churches with relics and treasures. These gifts weren't random acts of generosity. They were bridges between England's regions. Monasteries became spiritual centers that helped unify communities through shared rituals, language, and moral teachings. The church also served as an administrative backbone. Bishops and abbots could read, write, and manage estates, making them indispensable partners in governance. Æthelstan's emphasis on religious unity strengthened national identity in a period when many other kingdoms struggled with fragmentation. In the wake of Brunanburh, these institutions helped stabilize regions traumatized by war. Faith became both a source of comfort and a tool for political cohesion. Suggested visuals, shots of ancient stone churches, monks chanting, close-ups of religious relics, calm countryside monasteries, illuminated manuscripts of gospel scenes. As the 930s progressed, Æthelstan began shaping policies and alliances that extended beyond his lifetime. He envisioned an England that would endure, not merely survive. His laws encouraged social mobility based on merit and loyalty. His diplomatic ties ensured peace across the Channel. His religious investments fortified cultural identity. His control of the North stabilized borders that had been contested for centuries. This long-term vision set England on a path toward later triumphs under rulers like Edgar the Peaceful, and much later, the firmness needed to withstand the Norman invasion. Æthelstan could not have foreseen every future event, but he understood a truth that outlived him. A unified kingdom required more than victory. It required structure, culture, and shared purpose. Suggested visuals, cinematic shots of English landscapes, symbolic time-lapse transitions, maps evolving over decades, heraldic imagery fading in and out. By around 938–939, Æthelstan had become the most powerful ruler in the history of the British Isles. His military triumphs established security. His governance reforms strengthened institutions. His cultural and religious patronage cultivated unity, and his diplomacy placed England firmly within the network of European monarchies. At this peak, chroniclers described him as wise, commanding, and deeply conscientious. He listened to counsel yet made decisions decisively. He traveled constantly, meeting his people, settling disputes, and reinforcing royal authority. His reign was not defined by one battle, but by the totality of his accomplishments. Yet even at the height of his power, the pressures of leadership were immense. The kingdom was stable, but stability required vigilance. New threats lingered at the edges, and time itself was beginning to close in on England's greatest early king. Suggested visuals, majestic shots of a king riding across fields, court scenes full of activity, slow pans across royal relics, atmospheric reenactments of Æthelstan in royal halls. The battlefield of Brunanburh did not fall silent quickly. Long after the final shield broke and the last war cry faded, Æthelstan walked through the remnants of the day's struggle. The cost was staggering. English bodies lay among the enemy's fallen, men from Wessex, Mercia, Kent, East Anglia. But for all the grief embedded in the soil, Æthelstan understood the significance of what had taken place. This was not just a victory, it was a turning point. For over a century, kings of Wessex had fought to push back the Danelaw, to unify the fragmented kingdoms of early medieval Britain. But at Brunanburh, the last great coalition had been shattered. There would be no second attempt with such force. The future, though still uncertain, finally felt reachable. Æthelstan's England, an idea once seen as ambitious, even unrealistic, now stood not simply imagined, but forged in the hardest fire a king could face. Suggested visuals, slow tracking shots across a misty battlefield, abandoned shields, broken spears, ravens circling overhead, Æthelstan's silhouette moving among the fallen. To understand what Æthelstan truly accomplished, we must look beyond the battlefield. For centuries, the island had been a mosaic of shifting loyalties and competing rulers, Northumbrians in the north, Mercians in the Midlands, West Saxons in the south, Welsh kingdoms to the west, and Scandinavian power structures embedded across the east. Brunanburh didn't magically erase these identities, but it forced a reckoning. English unity, once a distant ideal, now felt inevitable. Chroniclers of the time wrote about the battle with unusual intensity, praising Æthelstan as the King of Kings. the ruler who finally secured a single political horizon. What changed wasn't just borders, it was imagination. People began to conceive of themselves as part of one realm, under one law, and protected by one crown. That shift in identity would echo far beyond Æthelstan's reign, influencing medieval government, trade, defense, and diplomacy. Suggested visuals: animated map of Anglo-Saxon England solidifying into a single color, parchment manuscripts, illuminated letters highlighting Æthelstan's name, villages and trade routes reconnecting. After Brunanburh, Æthelstan was no longer merely a successful ruler. He became a symbol. His court chroniclers, foreign envoys, and even his rivals began describing him differently. As a statesman, a lawgiver, a visionary king who saw England as more than territory. For Æthelstan, victory did not bring complacency. It brought responsibility. He intensified efforts to standardize currency, ensure fair measurements, and regulate trade. These details often go unnoticed in heroic narratives, yet they mattered more to everyday people than battlefield triumphs. Æthelstan wanted stability. He wanted a realm where justice didn't depend on regional customs or personal favors, but on predictable, consistent law. Some of these ideas were revolutionary for the 10th century. Others were building blocks that later kings, Edgar, Alfred's successors, even Norman rulers, would refine. But the shift began here, when the king who won at Brunanburh decided that peace required as much determination as war. One of the lesser-known aspects of Æthelstan's reign was how connected he became to the rest of Europe. His court was cosmopolitan, filled with scholars from distant regions, envoys from Frankish lands, and even noble hostages raised in the English tradition. These relationships were deliberate. Æthelstan understood that England's stability depended on diplomacy as much as on military strength. His sisters were married into the royal families of the continent, alliances that helped deter external threats and elevated England's standing. When foreign kings wrote to Æthelstan, they addressed him not as a provincial ruler but as an equal. This mattered in an age when communication was slow, travel difficult, and reputation was everything. Through these alliances, Æthelstan secured not only peace but prestige. He placed England on the European stage, signaling that it was no longer a collection of small kingdoms but a unified power with a coherent, respected monarchy. Æthelstan's court was more than a political center, it was a cultural powerhouse. Scholars specializing in law, scripture, poetry, and translation flocked to his side. The king himself was said to be deeply pious, a collector of books and relics, and a patron of monasteries across his realm. Under his guidance, scriptoria produced texts with remarkable craftsmanship, blending Christian theology with Anglo-Saxon artistry. This environment encouraged learning at a moment when much of Europe was intellectually fragmented. Æthelstan's support for monastic reform would lay vital groundwork for the flourishing that followed under later kings. He wasn't just building England's political identity, he was shaping its cultural and spiritual identity as well. In a world where literacy was rare and books were priceless, the king's commitment to knowledge set him apart from many rulers of his age. Victories, even monumental ones, never eliminate tension forever. After Brunanburh, various regions still tested Æthelstan's authority. Northumbria, with its long history of independence, remained particularly difficult. Though the Norse coalition had been defeated, pockets of Scandinavian influence persisted. Meanwhile, Welsh rulers, though subdued, did not always embrace English oversight. Æthelstan navigated these conflicts with a mixture of firmness and diplomacy, reinforcing alliances while projecting military strength where needed. What's striking is how rarely he relied solely on force. He understood that unified rule came from legitimacy, not fear. By reinforcing law, encouraging trade, and treating regional leaders with a degree of respect uncommon for the time, he built a political structure that could endure even after his death. Not all tensions disappeared. Some regions simmered with resentment, but the overall trajectory was clear. England was becoming harder to break apart. Northumbria was always the hinge on which English unification turned. Rich, strategically crucial, and deeply influenced by both Anglo-Saxon and Norse culture, it resisted southern control for generations. Æthelstan recognized this reality, and he approached the region with unusual nuance. Rather than crush it with military might, though he certainly showed force when needed, he invested in its churches, its fortifications, and its economic networks. His regular presence there signaled that Northumbria wasn't a conquered province but an integral part of the evolving English kingdom. And over time, loyalty grew, not uniformly, not permanently, but enough to reshape expectations. By the end of his reign, Northumbria was more stable than it had been in decades. Æthelstan had achieved what most kings before him could not. He made the north part of a functioning national framework, not an isolated frontier. By the mid-930s, Æthelstan's reputation had spread across the known world. Scholars compared him to Charlemagne, poets praised his battlefield heroism. Chroniclers wrote that no earlier king had ruled all of England so effectively. Yet what truly defined his reign wasn't just martial prowess or legal reform. It was the creation of a political concept that would outlive him: an English nation. When he ascended the throne, the idea of a unified England was fragile, fragile enough to shatter under the right pressure. But by the time he reached his late 30s, Æthelstan had turned that idea into a practical reality. He laid the foundations for centralized governance, for standardized law, for diplomacy rooted in credibility rather than desperation. His successors would inherit something rare in medieval Europe: a kingdom with momentum. Despite his accomplishments, Æthelstan was no mythic hero. He was a human being shaped by hardship, ambition, and loss. He was raised partly in his grandfather Alfred's court, partly in Mercia, and partly on campaign. He lived through political rivalries, family tension, and constant threats from within and beyond the island. He never married, and some historians speculate that his dedication to kingship left little room for personal life. Others argue that he forged paternal bonds with young nobles he fostered at court, shaping the next generation of leaders. Regardless of the details, Æthelstan carried the weight of kingship intensely. His letters and decrees reveal a ruler concerned with justice, morality, and religious duty, yet also aware of the brutal realities of power. This blend of idealism and pragmatism may be the key to understanding why he succeeded where others failed. By the early 940s, Æthelstan's long years of leadership began to show. He was still respected, still feared, and still capable of decisive action, but the strain of ruling a newly unified kingdom weighed heavily on him. England was stable, yet stability required constant vigilance, negotiating with regional leaders, monitoring Viking activity, ensuring the succession remained secure. Æthelstan had no direct heir, which added a layer of anxiety to his later reign. He began spending more time in religious devotion, funding churches, granting charters, and supporting communities that could preserve the spiritual health of his kingdom. His focus shifted subtly from expansion to preservation, from building England to ensuring it would endure beyond him. Even as he aged, his commitment never faltered. Æthelstan understood that a king's final task was not just to rule well, but to leave behind a realm strong enough to thrive without him. Even in his later years, Æthelstan did not completely withdraw from the demands of kingship. His authority still extended across Wales, Scotland, and the northern frontier. While Brunanburh had broken the Great Coalition, the stability that followed required constant maintenance. Small skirmishes still erupted, alliances needed refreshing, borders needed watching. Æthelstan personally oversaw these affairs whenever his health allowed, carefully choosing which issues demanded intervention and which could be resolved through diplomacy. What distinguished these final campaigns from earlier ones was their purpose. They weren't about conquest or glory. They were about safeguarding the realm he had built. The king who once charged at the front of battle now acted more like a guardian, ensuring his kingdom stood firm even as political winds shifted. These actions, quiet but critical, reinforced England's cohesion at a time when most medieval realms fractured under far lighter pressures. As Æthelstan aged, one issue rose above all others: who would succeed him? He had no children, and his brothers were the natural candidates. But succession in early medieval England was rarely straightforward. The king's legitimacy had come from his personal authority, his victories, and his political alliances, not just his bloodline. He worried that a weak succession could unravel everything he had achieved. Æthelstan began preparing his half-brother Edmund for future rule, involving him in councils, granting him military responsibilities, and subtly positioning him as the kingdom's next protector. This mentoring relationship reveals something important. Æthelstan wasn't simply looking for a replacement. He was trying to create continuity. He knew that a unified England was still fragile. If its next ruler faltered, the kingdom could splinter again. In his careful planning, we see a king thinking beyond his own life, shaping the future he would never witness. In his final years, Æthelstan traveled less frequently, but each journey carried weight. He visited key religious centers, endowed monasteries, and confirmed legal charters. These acts reflected both gratitude and foresight. Gratitude for the scholars and monks who had supported his reign, and foresight in ensuring the institutions of learning and faith would sustain England's identity long after he was gone. Chroniclers noted that Æthelstan seemed reflective, even solemn, as if he sensed his time was drawing short. Yet he never retreated fully from public life. Even when visibly tired, he appeared at assemblies, listened to petitions, and ensured justice was delivered. The king who forged England remained committed to governing until the very end. His movements during these years reveal a ruler deeply aware of his mortality, but determined to preserve the flame he had ignited. Æthelstan died on October 27, 939 in the town of Gloucester. He was around 45 years old, a relatively young age, even by medieval standards. His death sent ripples across the British Isles and the continent. Chroniclers wrote with genuine sorrow, noting that the shelter of the English had passed. For years, his presence had held rivals at bay. Now they sensed opportunity. And indeed, shortly after his death, unrest flared in the north and external forces tested England's borders. But even in this turbulence, Æthelstan's foundational work endured. The country did not disintegrate. Edmund took the throne, guided in part by the example his brother had set. England wavered, but it did not collapse, a testament to how thoroughly Æthelstan had reshaped the kingdom. His physical life ended, but the political identity he carved from chaos outlasted him. England did face challenges after Æthelstan's death. Northumbria seceded temporarily. Viking exiles returned. Welsh rulers reassessed their allegiances. But even these disruptions reveal how strong the unified structure had become. Rather than spiraling into prolonged civil war, England recalibrated. Edmund and later kings reclaimed lost ground, relying heavily on the administrative frameworks Æthelstan had cemented: standardized laws, reliable coinage, fortified burghs, and alliances with continental powers. In other words, the kingdom had momentum. Æthelstan had turned England from a loose federation of regions into a functioning state. That transformation allowed his successors to recover quickly from setbacks that would once have been catastrophic. This outcome is one of the clearest indicators of his importance. A weaker king's legacy evaporates at death. Æthelstan's legacy survived, adapted, and grew. After his death, Æthelstan's memory evolved in fascinating ways. Anglo-Saxon chroniclers praised him as a heroic king, but later medieval writers, especially after the Norman conquest, sometimes overshadowed him with more famous rulers like Alfred or William the Conqueror. Yet modern historians have rediscovered his brilliance, placing him among the most important monarchs of early medieval Europe. They point to his diplomacy, his legal reforms, his military leadership, and his cultural patronage. More importantly, they highlight that he was the first to rule a truly unified England, not just a southern kingdom aspiring to dominance, but a nation stretching from the Channel to the Northern Sea. Today, Æthelstan is increasingly seen not as a transitional figure between Alfred and later kings, but as the architect of medieval England itself. His reputation is finally catching up to his accomplishments. Æthelstan's legacy can be measured in three dimensions: political, cultural, and ideological. Politically, he created the first framework for national governance: uniform laws, stable borders, functional administration. Culturally, he brought scholars to England, elevated monastic learning, and strengthened ties with Europe's intellectual centers. Ideologically, he introduced the notion that England was not simply a cluster of tribes or regions, but a single people with shared identity. This idea did not fully take root during his lifetime, but it was planted, and it would grow across generations, shaping everything from medieval literature to the expectations of later monarchs. Even today, the modern British state traces part of its origin to the moment Æthelstan transformed an island of shifting loyalties into a unified realm. Few rulers have such far-reaching influence, and fewer still accomplish it within a lifespan cut short. When viewed from a broader global context, Æthelstan's reign stands out even more. While empires were rising and falling across Asia, Africa, and the Islamic world, England was still forming its identity. Æthelstan's accomplishment, creating a stable, recognizable kingdom on the northwest edge of Europe, was not inevitable. Many early medieval polities fractured permanently. Others remained tied to competing tribes or powerful nobles. England, thanks largely to Æthelstan, took a different path. His blend of diplomacy, warfare, legal reform, and culture building resembles the strategies used by other great state-makers across history. In this light, Æthelstan belongs in a global conversation about leadership, a ruler who inherited a fragmented land and left behind a functioning nation-state. His name might not be as widely known as Caesar or Charlemagne, but his impact on the medieval world and on the future is arguably just as profound. Why should a 10th-century king matter today? Because Æthelstan's story speaks to universal themes: unity forged from division, leadership shaped by adversity, and the idea that identity can be built from shared purpose rather than geography. His life reminds us that nations are not accidents. They are crafted by people willing to endure hardship, push boundaries, and imagine structures bigger than themselves. In an age where borders continue to shift and national identities are constantly re-examined, Æthelstan's story holds surprising relevance. He understood that power without justice collapses, that strength without diplomacy falters, and that unity without shared identity never lasts. These lessons echo far beyond his era. The England we know today, its laws, its monarchy, its cultural backbone, rests in part on the foundations he laid. His story matters because it shows how one determined leader can shape the fate of millions across centuries. As we close this journey through Æthelstan's life, one truth becomes clear. He was not merely a king, he was a creator. He took a land divided by culture, war, and geography, and he forged a unified kingdom. He defeated the greatest coalition ever assembled against early England. He formed alliances across Europe, built institutions that outlived him, elevated scholarship, strengthened law, and established a sense of national identity that would guide the island's destiny for 1,000 years. He died young, but his achievements were vast. His name may not echo as loudly as some of history's giants, yet without Æthelstan, medieval England, and by extension, the modern English-speaking world, would be unrecognizable. This is the legacy of Æthelstan the Glorious, a ruler who transformed a vision into reality, a nation builder whose influence spanned centuries, and a king whose story, once hidden in the shadows of history, now deserves its rightful place in the light. Thank you for joining this exploration of the first true king of England.